Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is titled, The Bear Who Stalked and Killed Harley Piper. The date was November 4th, 1988. It was a cold, blustery day, and Harley Piper and his hunting party were heading up to hunt deer on the south end of Baranof Island off the coast of Alaska, near Port Alexander. This part of Alaska is essentially a temperate rainforest with abundant moisture, cool temperatures, and lots of thick vegetation. The deer hunting is great, and the target is Sitka black-tailed deer, which is a diminutive version of the same black-tailed deer found in the western United States and Canada. Baranof Island is a mountainous, unforgiving environment and features some world-class scenery and lots of bears. The bears here subsist off of deer and various plants and berries when seasonally available. During the salmon runs, the bears feast off of the skin and eggs of the females to build the fat they will need to survive hibernation. The hunting party included David Trejo from Juneau and James Hendricks from Port Alexander, both in their 30s, and Harley, who was 40 years old. Each of the men were in healthy shape and ready to hit the bush for a great time pursuing their favorite target. The three men agreed to go in different directions and ironed out the usual safety signals and plans. Harley decided to walk down the beach as a way to put distance between him and his partners. He then walked a couple of 100 yards into the bush until he located a patch of muskeg, which is a swampy area that grass grows in and is great for watching for moving animals. He found a spruce tree for cover and sat down to use his deer call. His equipment was in his pockets, and he fumbled around looking for various items he was planning on using during his hunt. As Harley called, his head surveyed the bush around the muskeg, carefully watching for deer to bust out of cover and check out what was going on. The safety of his rifle was on, and he removed his scope cover so he could quickly zoom in on anything that drew his attention. He was enjoying his time in the peaceful surroundings. Suddenly, an eruption of growling and grunting surrounded Harley. He turned around to see a huge male brown bear closing in on him quickly from only 30 yards. The bear's back paws were digging into the soil as it put all of its energy into pursuing its prey. The bear was unavoidable to Harley now, as he had only a fraction of a second to react before the bear's impact sent him spilling onto his back. Harley's eyeglasses and cap were sent sailing through the air, and his rifle was driven halfway into the muskeg. The bear immediately broke Harley's neck and began tearing his body apart. A few hundred yards away, Harley's hunting buddies heard Harley scream and the bear growl. They immediately hurried to the location. They arrived at the attack scene, and Harley was gone. Only a scattered spread of his possessions and pools of his blood remained. The two men immediately left the area to gather help to find their friend. A small search party from nearby Sitka had arrived on scene and were milling around when search and rescue expert Don Cluting, who was trained in tracking and was an EMT, arrived on the scene. From the attack scene, the search party followed a drag trail left by the bear as it hauled Harley off. The drag trail was littered with torn clothing, tissue, and bone fragments, and was covered with blood. The bear dragged Harley parallel to the beach for half a mile, and the armed search party followed the trail warily. The trail continued for a while before the party, which included Harley's hunting buddies, reached a particularly gory and bloody point. Harley's hunting buddies were visibly shaken by the scene and decided to turn back. They were overwhelmed by the day's events. Roland Young, who was an Alaska State Trooper, took command of 6 of the men, and Don led the other 6 men, and they took the lead to follow the trail. Roland's group would document evidence as it was discovered and mark its location, as the other party would search for the next. The search party continued in this manner until they could only find the drag trail. No more blood, bone fragments, or tattered clothes. Suddenly, a deep growl rumbled across the forest, very near to the search party members. Don immediately instructed 3 of his men to stay on the nearby ridge, as the other 3 slowly crept uphill about 20 yards. 2 of the men lost their nerve and lagged behind cautiously, while Don continued on another few yards, when suddenly he spotted the bear's giant head in the bush. The same moment he spotted the bear, the angry Bruin quickly charged the 3 men left on the ridge. There was only 70 yards between the enraged bear as it initiated its charge and the men. The brush whipped and tossed as the bear steamrolled anything in its path. It was moving so quickly that Don could only process a brown blur as it flashed through the undergrowth. Don and another search party member both fired a shot at the bear, but despite being vitally wounded, it didn't even slow down. The 2 men feverishly worked the actions on their rifles, while the bear closed to within 20 yards of the men on the ridge. Don and his partner each fired another shot, and that diverted the bear's anger towards them. The bear's eyes were burning with rage, and it was coming to kill Don and his friend. Fortunately, the last 2 shots struck the bear's shoulders, and as it turned toward the pair, it collapsed and rolled onto its back. Don took 11 steps and was alongside the fierce giant, and humanely fired a shot into its skull for insurance. The men who were standing on the ridge were a mere 2 steps from where the bear fell. The charge had caused such chaos amongst the men on the ridge that one of them tripped and dangled over a 20-foot cliff. Another had stepped into a hole up to his hips and was firing into the air, but managed to shoot the bear in the foot. The third man's rifle had misfired, with a round lodged in the chamber. Don radioed back to Roland to let him know it was over and the bear was dead. The party proceeded to the location where the bear had initially growled at them. They found Harley's partially consumed body buried under a bunch of duff piled up by the bear. The bear had apparently been laying on Harley's remains when the search party walked upon the scene. They collected Harley's remains into a recovery bag to bring him back to his family. Don skinned the bear as part of his investigation and noted that the very healthy male had nearly 0 body fat with a very thick hide. The bear's pelt was nearly 10 feet square when laid out on the ground, which is a giant bear. The unprovoked attack is a rare event, but it is believed the bear's predatory instinct was triggered after hearing the deer call Harley was using. After that, Harley was simply a food source. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place on Raspberry Island, which is an island just north of Kodiak Island in Alaska. Raspberry Island is a rolling hill country covered with brush and grass. The streams are filled with salmon seasonally, and the hills with berries. The perfect environment for bears, very large bears. It was a cold, blustery day in November 1999. Gene Moe was hunting deer on Raspberry Island, a very remote and primitive location. Gene knew well that when it snowed, like other areas, deer on Raspberry Island would be pushed to lower elevations to find browse and shelter. The location is a mountainous wilderness filled with hazards and excitement, just the way the 69-year-old liked it. He spent many a season in the backwoods, enjoying solitude and peace. This year was possibly the last time he would enjoy this environment. He was going to make the most of it. After a few days of hunting together, he and his hunting partner Steve decided to split up to cover different areas and mitigate their different perspectives and strategies. Gene told Steve that if he heard a shot to come and assist, just to make sure everything was okay. Even though the hunting partners were only a few hundred yards apart, Gene managed to call in a Sitka blacktail, the predominant deer species of the area. As twilight was creeping in, Gene leaned over his buck and started to process his harvest. He used his 4-inch buck knife to gut the deer and started to remove the hide from the carcass. Gene leaned his rifle up against a tree nearby while he worked. In a chaotic explosion of swaying bushes and growling, an extremely large brown bear emerged from the brush a very short distance away. The Bruin was foaming at the mouth and spitting and growling through razor-sharp yellow teeth. Armed with only his knife, Gene readied himself for a life-or-death confrontation. He knew if he ran, he would trigger the bear's predatory instincts and be overcome from behind, the most vulnerable direction. He stared the hungry bear in the eyes and conveyed a devotion and commitment met by the bear's. The ears of the bear lowered, and its head dropped in the final signal of commitment. The bear surged forward toward Gene. He had no previous experience to fall back on, so he decided to extend the only defensive weapon he had, his skinning knife. He held the blade out straight toward the charging bear and placed his feet far apart to brace for impact. Gene was 6 feet 1 inch tall and in great shape. He worked out regularly for hunting and fishing seasons. You see, Gene was a product of the Great Depression, and those folks did not shrink from hardship nor threat. Years of finishing concrete had honed his physique and resolve. As the giant bear closed the 30 feet that separated the pair, Gene prayed out loud, saying, "Lord, I need your help. Help me, Lord." The bear didn't hesitate as it drew on years of instinct. As the bear blurred toward Gene, the edge of the knife held forward didn't strike the bear's mouth, as Gene had intended, but skimmed along the Bruin's cheek and sliced open a gash along the length of its skull. The now injured and angered bear clamped down on Gene's right arm, around his bicep, tearing the muscle and flesh from just above his elbow all the way down to his wrist. From the pain of the initiation of the attack, Gene thought his arm was completely torn off. The direction and force of the bear's focus caused Gene to turn towards the bear, and he instinctively wrapped his left arm around the neck of the giant predator. Gene tried to poke the bear in the eye. Instead, he managed to get his first finger into its ear and pushed it in as far as he could. The bear reacted with confusion and pulled back. With his arm still around its neck, the bear suplexed Gene like a professional wrestler. Amazed at the ease of which the bear just launched him about 10 feet, Gene sprang back to his feet. The bear, now only about 5 yards away, took a few seconds to review the situation. It stood on its hind legs and walked towards its adversary. Like a wary boxer, Gene watched the bear's right paw, knowing most are like humans and prefer their right side. Gene circled to his left as the bear struck out with its right paw. Even though Gene pulled his head back, one of the bear's claws bisected his left ear. The bear immediately followed up with a quick swipe from its left paw, which landed on Gene's right leg and knocked him to the ground. The claws from the bear tore up his leg and parted skin, muscle, and tendon. As the bear closed in, Gene put his boots together and double-kicked the bear just under the chin, sending it backward, knocking it down. Gene beat the bear back to his feet. By this point in the brawl, Gene had recognized that the death battle had an informally defined arena. The bear circled to Gene's left, and he knew from experience the Bruin would use its left paw to attack. Gene slipped inside of it and was pressed into the bear's chest. The bear twisted its head to catch Gene's right knee and clamped down. Instinctively, Gene tried to gain leverage and wrapped his arm around the bear's neck, but the bear was too strong. Gene swung his blade up to just below the bear's jaw and plunged it in repeatedly. He dug the blade in as far as he could, and the bear pulled back in resistance. The bear's right paw wrapped around Gene's left buttock, and he lifted the man off the ground to attempt another pro wrestler-style slam. Without the added power of its right leg, the bear couldn't complete the motion and had to release its grip on the man. As the bear did this, Gene took his blade, and with as much energy as he could muster, he plunged the short blade into the flesh just behind the bear's massive head. This strike hit something hard, and the bear retreated a short distance, with its head cocked to one side and spraying blood all over Gene. The bear seemed to shrink as it gushed blood. Gene yelled, "Come on, bear, the Lord is on my side." And with that challenge, the 750-pound Bruin leapt the 6-foot distance toward Gene. In a last-ditch effort, Gene swung his left fist with all the fury a man fighting for his life could muster, striking the bear just below the right eye. The bear quivered for a split second and bounced off the ground in a heap. The way the bear collapsed with its feet and head under its body, Gene knew the bear was dead. With his knife still clasped in his right hand and his left hand still clenched in a fist, Gene knew he would ensure his victory with a resounding blast from his rifle. He had to open his right fist with his teeth and his now numb left hand to grasp his rifle. Pushing the dangling flesh of his right arm back into position, Gene fired 2 shots to ensure the end of the struggle. Gene then realized the first part of his struggle had ended, and he needed to get back to the beach to survive. He pushed his way through the dense alders for about 2 miles as branches pulled at his mutilated right arm. He was exhausted, thirsty, and decided to lay down to die. He prayed to God to take him from his condition. He fell and got back up 3 times before finally reaching the beach. Gene was too far gone to continue and mustered a loud yell to his hunting partners, and they responded. Approaching him, they witnessed his clothes torn to tatters and his body ripped up beyond hope. Gene begged his friends to shoot him and end his misery. The trio rounded up Gene's son and sped toward the nearest radio in 40 miles. Gene's son tore fabric strips into impromptu bandages as the group rendered their best version of first aid. The U.S. Coast Guard was notified and happened to be completing exercises in the area. They immediately flew toward the remote location to help. The doctor at Kodiak's new hospital worked on Gene for 7 hours, sewing up his wounds. A group of Gene's friends and volunteers decided to head up to the attack scene, following Gene's blood trail. They located his rifle and found the dead bear. It was a 13-year-old sow who had chased off her 2 cubs just a short time earlier to fatten up for the winter. She attacked him out of hunger because that year the salmon had not run.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the remote and nearly untouched Glacier Bay National Park and Reserve with its iconic glaciers and fjords. The park is located in southeast Alaska along the coast and presents some of the most beautiful scenery on Earth. The forests are lush and green with giant pines and all kinds of berry bushes. The bay itself lies to the east of where our events that we are discussing today occurred. This area is remote and rugged. Help is not close, nor is it fast in response. Most people who travel to this area understand that if they get into trouble, they're on their own. On September 10th of 1976, 25-year-old Alan Precup arranged for his backpacking trip into the preserve through the visitor's office. He was up from Illinois and had quickly embraced the Alaskan lifestyle and experience. He established his travel route and timeline so they would know where he was planning on visiting and when he would be back. When September 13th rolled around, Mr. Precup did not meet officials at his pickup time and location. A search party was immediately launched to find him. On September 16th, a party including Charles Jackson, Leilani Vega, Peter Talbot, and Colin Milmer were hiking into the White Thunder Ridge area just above Muir Inlet. The group had been briefed on Mr. Precup and had agreed to keep an eye out for him. They were only planning on staying a single night and being picked up on the 17th, but it made them a little more comfortable to know that there were search crews in the area. The group began setting up their camp to prepare their soup lunch and hot chocolate. The fresh air rejuvenated them as they embraced their short-lived experience to the fullest. It was a little after 11:30 a.m. when Mr. Talbot noticed a brown dot approaching in the distance along the lake. It could be a caribou, or maybe a moose. It didn't look big enough to be a moose, though. Slowly the brown dot approached, and the friends discerned it was a smallish brown bear. The group decided to take some proactive measures to make sure this bear knew they were there and were not prey. They grabbed pots and pans and anything else and clanged it together and yelled to frighten the bear. Each time they did this, the bear would stop and look around, seemingly confused, but then would continue heading toward them after a few seconds. The party now decided that the safest thing they could do is to pack up their food items and head over to a shelf of cliffs in a respectful attempt to get out of the bear's intended travel route. He would probably just walk right past them and go be a bear somewhere else. They labored to the cliff tops and found trees to cache their food in. As they looked down upon their camp, they could see the bear trashing their tents and biting anything he could find with human scent. Then the bear dropped its nose, like a bloodhound, onto the group's trail. The bear sniffed along the exact path they used to get to the safety of the cliffs. They immediately decided they needed to make more space between them and the bear, so they headed further away from camp along the cliff. They looked back at their food stash, expecting to see the bear pulling in their food bags, but the bear kept his nose to the ground and followed their trail. He wasn't interested in a food cache, just the people. They half ran, half walked the steep cliffs surrounding the lake and arrived back at their camp at 1:15. The bear had followed their scent trail the entire time. The group decided to seek protection on the hill above their camp and began hiking in that direction. The bear followed them, now a mere 20 feet behind. They'd removed jackets and ponchos and anything else to cool themselves, as the exertion from the pursuit made them sweat. At the top of the hill there was a large swale that separated the bear from the campers, only about 10 feet apart. The danger and fright of the situation had well set in with the group, and they decided they must defend themselves. They had very few weapons of any use in defense, so they armed themselves with rocks and began pelting the bear. Seemingly confused from the yelling and chaos, the bear walked a short distance away and laid down, putting his head on his paws. It observed every movement anyone in the group made. A bush plane flew over during the incident on the top of the hill. It circled around 5 times or so, and the group felt confident they'd been seen. They expected the pilot to buzz the bear and run him off, but they were wrong. They'd not been seen by the pilot, and their predicament was unnoted by anyone. They decided that they would use the cover of the plane to go down the hill to some other campers in the area. They quickly dropped down the hill and discussed the bizarre situation with their new friends. The now larger group looked on as they watched the bear crest the hill and carefully sniff out each of the human tracks. Now looked like a great time to beat feet back to the Forest Service boat, which they safely arrived at about 3:30 in the afternoon. The rangers listened with concern and alarm as they described the bear's behavior. The authorities immediately dispatched Park Ranger James Luthi to investigate by helicopter. Luthi's ranger crew flew over a destroyed camp and radioed down to hiking rangers to investigate. Luthi prepped himself to be lowered from the helicopter to look over things himself as well. Luthi witnessed many of Precup's possessions with bite marks and damage from the bear, but couldn't locate Alan. He reboarded the copter and they left, while they waited for the rangers on foot to get to the scene. The bear basically bit into everything that had human scent. The rangers encountered the bear near the camp and pelted it with rocks and eventually drove it off. After searching the area, they located the grim remains of Alan Precup. The bear had efficiently picked Alan's bones clean in the few days since the attack. His clothes lay beside his skeletal remains, and his ribs were strewn about the vicinity. His arms were torn or chewed from his body, and his skull was completely defleshed and set where his neck would be. His nearly intact scalp lay nearby, and his right hand lay beneath a page of a book apart from its arm. His feet were still in his socks and boots. Alan's remains were removed from the area and returned to his family for burial. There was no conclusive link made, but authorities are sure the bear that ate Alan was also the bear that chased the Jackson group around the lake. I could find no record of what became of the bear and assume that it had escaped after confronting the rangers. Authorities determined there was an abundance of berries and salmon in the area that year, and Alan Precup's attack was solely predatory.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode brings us to the wild and rugged mountains of western Montana and the beauty of Glacier National Park. The tragedy of our focus today happened against all odds with 2 separate bears to 2 completely different camps on the same night. In the dark of night on August 12, 1967, young lovers Julie Helgeson and Roy Ducat were basking in the magnificence of the heavenlies and developing a devotion for each other and the wilderness. They both worked for the Glacier Park Lodge, located only 21 miles from their campsite as the crow flies. Earlier in the day, they hitched a ride up the famous Going to the Sun Road along McDonald Lake and veered north at the Highline Trail. It is several miles hiking into the Granite Park Chalet, crisscrossing some of the most amazing views known to mankind.
With their bedrolls laid out and camp set up, they settled in for a cozy, relaxing night, illuminated only by the stars as the moon was not out. They made camp only a quarter mile from the chalet because the chalet was booked full. Round midnight, Julie shook Roy awake, whispering, "There's a bear nearby. Don't move." The bear meandered around the terrified couple and approached aggressively. It immediately attacked Roy as he was in his sleeping bag. The bag may have offered very little protection given the lethal weapons the bear possessed, but it was all the protection Roy had. Powerful Grizzly clasped its jaws on Roy's sleeping bag and ragdolled it, throwing Roy a few yards away onto his face. Before he could gather his senses, the bear was on his back, attacking him with its claws and jaws. It bit his back twice and bit his leg once. He soon remembered the instructions on what to do in a bear confrontation. He decided to play dead, and the bear stopped mauling him. After mauling Roy, the bear turned its attention to Julie. Julie screamed out, "It hurts! Somebody help us!" as the bear savaged her. Screaming and terrified, Julie was dragged into the nearby forest by the powerful brown bear. Roy initially ran down the hill to their equipment to try to scare the bear off with a camera flash bulb, but couldn't find it. His left arm had been bitten and clawed badly, and he started to realize the extent of his injuries. He next decided to run back up the mountain to the chalet to try to find help. Just outside of the chalet, he found Don Gullett sleeping under the stars the same way he and Julie were. Roy violently shook Don to consciousness and stuttered the details to the groggy man. The chalet occupants were awakened by Julie's screams as well as the noise Don and Roy were making. Concerned people started poking out of the doors and windows of the chalet. Don decided to proceed up to the chalet, but Bob Klein, who was camping nearby, stopped him with an alternative. Bob pulled out a powerful flashlight and began signaling the chalet with the SOS signal in Morse code from a relative safety of a forestry cabin roof. Seeing the flashlight signal from the cabin deck, John Lipinski, who was a surgeon, yelled out, "What's the problem?" And the eerie response returned from the dark, "Bear!" Joan Devereaux was a naturalist staying at the chalet. She immediately radioed for assistance from authorities. Steve Pierre was a member of the local Kalispel Native American tribe and was recruited into assistance. Pierre agreed to take a group to the site in the dark during a bear attack. Drawing from the wisdom of his grandfather, Pierre grabbed a galvanized steel water basin and filled it with wood. The men would use it as a torch and light to keep the bears at bay as they approached the attack scene. The men set out down the trail as if participating in some ceremonial light-bearing ritual. Bert Gildart was a forest ranger doing road patrol when Devereaux's emergency assistance request cracked across his radio. Bert immediately contacted headquarters and relayed medical needs and information to Gary Bunny, who was a fire control officer working on wildfires in the area. The authorities then contacted helicopter pilot John Westover. Now, Westover was not just some ordinary helicopter pilot. John was the personal pilot for a general during the Vietnam War, as well as a combat pilot. He was renowned for his bravery and guts, but flying through the smoke-filled mountains under the curtain of the dark of night would be new territory for the aviation fanatic. Back at the chalet, Devereaux prepped an impromptu emergency helipad. Despite Roy's pleas for the group to find Julie, Devereaux instructed them to wait for a ranger with a rifle. Father Connolly and other chalet occupants set to work on the landing pad and gathered flashlights to signal the helicopter with. Bunny and Westover jumped into the copter and navigated their way toward the chalet using the absence of stars to locate mountains. Bunny and Westover jumped into the copter and navigated their way toward the chalet using the absence of stars to locate mountains. The night was too dark to see anything else. Bunny did his best to use the red light from the instrumentation panel to read a topographical map, and Westover flew by instinct since the copter had no gauges for him to use. In an overzealous attempt to assist the pilot, people on the ground lit up the plexiglass dome of the copter, temporarily blocking what little visibility Westover had. His experience and brashness guided the copter to a safe landing on the improvised helipad at the chalet. Westover landed a helicopter with no instrumentation by firelight adjacent to a sheer cliff. Meanwhile, Pierre and his small cohort had found a faint blood trail. They also found a personal item of Julie's on the same path. The group started yelling Julie's name, and somehow faintly she responded, "It hurts." The bear had stripped her of her clothes, and she had several puncture wounds on her back where the bear had gripped her in its jaws. She was terribly mauled, and had scratches and bite marks all over her body.
She asked her rescuers to hold her hand, and they did. The rescue crew built an impromptu litter and carried her back to the chalet. There she was given emergency medical care. Lipinski and assistants tried to save her, but soon realized she had lost too much blood. Father Connolly said the Lord's Prayer with her as she slipped away at 4:13 a.m. of August 13th. Julie was the first fatality from bear attack in Glacier National Park's history, but she would not be the last. Approximately 4 hours after the first attack, and about 8 miles away, 5 employees of nearby McDonald Lodge had settled into their beds for the evening after spending the day hiking and enjoying their surroundings. The party included Paul Dunn, Michelle Coons, as well as brothers Ray and Ron Nelson. As the campers relaxed around the campsite, a gigantic silver grizzly bear crossed a nearby log jam, which was a typical travel route for the bears. The bear had an immense hump of muscle on his shoulders and was brazen in his attitude. The bear raided their food stores and departed back the same way it came. The group hastily relocated to camp down the shore to avoid another confrontation with the giant bear. The campers built up a fire with a log bulwark and reclined for the night. The giant bear did return briefly to eat a package of cookies the group left out on a log, then departed. The bear sporadically returned to woof and puff at the campers from the dark. The terrorized campers lay still, hoping that playing dead would prevent any further interactions. Paul Dunn could hear the heaving breaths of the giant bear and silently resented his malfunctioning zipper on his sleeping bag. The hungry Bruin clamped its mouth onto the sleeping bag and the shirt of Paul, which sent the man scurrying into the brush and up a nearby tree. He shouted warnings to the other campers. Paul instructed his fellow campers to run and stop playing dead. Each time one of the campers sprung from their sleeping bags to disappear into the darkness, it would startle the bear, but only temporarily, as he would come right back to investigate again. The others did run, but a terrified Michelle continued to play dead in her sleeping bag. The bear aggressively examined the best way to get to Michelle and ended up sticking its massive head into her bag and pulled her out by her arm. The onlookers heard Michelle say, "He's got my arm," followed by, "Oh my God, I'm dead." The wait was oppressive as the campers wondered about the actual fate of Michelle. Paul yelled at the others and quickly climbed down and rejoined the group on the lake shoreline. Each of them climbed a tree and waited tensely until dawn and the relief the light would bring. At that point, they climbed down from the safety of the trees and briskly hiked over Howe Ridge to the McDonald Lake Ranger Station. Along the way, their emotions meandered and some of them were overwhelmed at various points. Ranger Leonard Landa was on duty at the ranger station when the distraught group arrived. Landa had overheard the radio chatter about the bear attack near the chalet a few hours before and had initially confused the group's statements. He soon realized that they were talking about a completely different attack and armed himself to go to Trout Lake. He recruited the 3 men to accompany him. They bravely obliged. Ranger Gildart arrived at the station and immediately set out on pursuit of the group to assist as well. Upon arriving at Trout Lake, the rescue team found a fisherman who joined them. Paul and Ron and Ray located the attack scene and told the armed rangers where they saw the bear drag Michelle up the mountain. By now, Westover had received the radio call about the attack at Trout Lake and jumped back into his helicopter to assist there. He located an acceptable place to land and met up with the other men. The search party followed a drag trail littered with blood and tissue, but eventually found her body. The bear had mutilated and mauled her so terribly that many of the men showed signs of shock at the sight. Michelle's corpse was recovered and armed rangers returned to Trout Lake. A small group of rangers then cleared the area of any visitors and planted baits to try to lure the brown bear into range to dispatch it for good. They waited over the baits for several hours until shortly before dusk, then made their way to the Arrow Lake shelter cabin. They were relieved to get inside to safety and rest for the evening. In the morning, Park Ranger Gildart stepped out of the door into the morning air. Suddenly, in the bed of Camas Creek, just over 40 feet from him, the bear they were searching for was staring at him. The bear peeked above the foliage and then disappeared briefly. Then it stood on its hind legs to get a better view. Gildart yelled at the others in the cabin to bring the rifle, as the bear was right next to them. The bear started to approach the men, but these were not innocent teenagers naively enjoying the wilderness. The armed men took steady aim and killed the bear. The authorities flew in a biologist to perform a necropsy on the dead bear. The dead bear was dissected, and inside they found a clump of blonde hair. Authorities assigned several armed rangers to shoot any bear that came to the trash dumps near the chalet or anywhere near Trout Lake. They found and killed 4 bears within a day or so. The male bear shot at Trout Lake was emaciated despite having a gigantic frame, indicating it was having difficulty finding natural food. It also had broken glass embedded in its gums and was believed to be in excruciating pain. Among the bears killed was a sow with 2 cubs. She was killed near the chalet garbage dump. The sow had blood on her claws and was believed to be the bear that killed Helgeson. The necropsy revealed that she had an injury to the pad on one of her hind feet, probably due to stepping on broken glass or a tin can at the dump site. One of her cubs had his jaw shattered by a shot from one of the rangers, but miraculously lived through the winter, only to die the following year. An investigation revealed that the Granite Peak Chalet had an incinerator installed the prior year, but the staff decided not to use it, opting instead to dump their trash in a pit. The bears would come and search for food in the trash, and that would bring tourists who wanted to watch the bears. It was also noted that visitors to Kelly's camp had reported problems with the male bear shot at Trout Lake. He was noted to behave aggressively and scavenging at their camp dump site. The report also indicated that there were all sorts of wrappers and trash at Trout Lake, which apparently pulled the boar away from Kelly's camp to Trout Lake. Rangers removed 20 bags of trash from the Trout Lake campground. This account was memorialized in the PBS documentary Night of the Grizzlies and by a book of the same name by author Jack Olson. Authorities estimate that a single fatal bear attack would have the odds of 1 in a million, while the odds of 2 different bears attacking 2 different people in nearby locations would be incalculable.
Back to scary bear attacks. Today's episode takes us to the east side of the world-renowned Yellowstone National Park, which straddles the borders of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Yellowstone National Park features some of the most well-preserved natural ecosystems remaining in the modern world. The area is crowded with bison, moose, black and brown bear, wolves, and cougar, not to mention the plentiful deer, elk, and antelope. Each of these species offer their own degree of beauty and danger. Brian Matayoshi from Torrance, California was 57 years old and had recently retired as a pharmacist. Brian and his wife Marilyn were on their 4th visit to Yellowstone National Park and about halfway through their planned 3-week trip. The date was July 6th of 2011 and the time was around 11 a.m. The couple was approximately 1.5 kilometers down the Wapiti Lake Trail. They encountered a fellow hiker who allowed them to use his binoculars to view a sow grizzly and her 2 cubs from about 500 yards, an appropriate distance to view such dangerous predators. The couple had never spotted a bear in their previous visits, so this was a special treat for them. They took photos and continued down the trail. They had no idea that the bears they just photographed would be only 20 minutes from an appointment with destiny which would change each of their lives. The pair traveled down the trail about a quarter of a mile when they were fogged with a swarm of mosquitoes and decided to turn back the way they came. As they approached the area they previously saw the sow and cubs, they noticed the trio of bears was now a mere 100 yards from the trail they were on. Brian and Marilyn navigated a dense stand of lodgepole pine only to emerge just across from a grassy meadow from the bears. The sow bear, now in protection mode, trotted toward the couple, inducing instant panic. Brian turned toward Marilyn and yelled, "Run!" They had no bear spray nor a firearm to fall back on, so they immediately began running away and yelling as the sow and cubs pursued out of curiosity or potentially another motive. As Brian and Marilyn entered the trailhead, they had passed signs warning of bear activity in the area and reminding hikers and photographers to lay down and play dead if involved in a confrontation with a bear, and to use bear spray as a last resort. Now the sow was closing in on them, and they had forgotten any instruction as they were convinced that they were in extreme danger. Most people consciously know that they cannot outrun a bear, but once fear dominates the mind, options become limited and panic prevails. The sow caught Brian about 270 yards into the pursuit and tackled him to the ground. Marilyn hid behind a fallen tree and tried to envision herself anywhere else but where she was. She lifted her head just in time to see the bear punch Brian in the head and knock him down again. Witnesses a few hundred yards away indicated Brian made animal sounds while being attacked, possibly in an attempt to frighten the bear or in mimicry of his attacker. The cubs were reportedly growling as they watched their mom bite and claw Brian, according to Marilyn. The sow spent a few minutes biting and clawing Brian's body as he fought her attack fruitlessly before Marilyn rose to her knees to adjust her camera position. She had laid on it as she collapsed behind the log and was now moving it from protruding into her side. The sow trotted over to Marilyn, who had begun to play dead by falling face first onto the ground. The sow picked Marilyn up by her backpack and slammed her into the ground to see if there was a reaction. The woman remained still, and the sow broke off the attack. It seemed as if the bear had to impart a final bit of intimidation to the woman before feeling confident enough to leave safely with her cubs. Marilyn quickly ran to Brian's side and improvised a tourniquet to Brian's wounded knee from a jacket. Brian released one last deep breath and was still. His life had ebbed as she tried to save him. He was motionless and unresponsive when a hiker in the area who was a trauma surgeon called 911. He was positioned just a few hundred yards away and somehow managed to get signal enough for the call, while Marilyn's 21 attempts failed. Authorities declined to perform an autopsy on Brian as his fatal injuries were obvious. He had a large gash and hematoma on his forehead from the blunt force trauma of the bear's punch. His femoral artery was also severed from the bite on his knee, causing rapid insanguination. The park authorities concluded the uncollared and untagged sow was acting defensively and had no previous acts of aggression toward humans, so they would not euthanize her nor her cubs. The Yellowstone National Park area is reported to be home to about 600 grizzly bears. The aggravating conditions regarding this incident included a deeper-than-normal snowpack, which forced the bears into lower elevations for browse, as well as pushing brown bears out of Yellowstone National Park into lower elevations surrounding the park. This incident resulted in the first bear attack fatality in Yellowstone National Park in 25 years. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. In today's episode, we travel back to Yellowstone National Park. Why, you ask? Well, this case is linked to the Brian Matsuoshi attack we posted last time in a very curious way. As we've discussed in our prior videos, Yellowstone National Park is seated on the world's largest batholith volcano, which is overdue for an eruption. The area is riddled with earthquakes several times a year, and it is this fact that creates its unique geography and marvels. Visitors from around the world travel here during when the park is open to view the sights such as Old Faithful Geyser, the Upper Geyser Basin, Morning Glory Pool, mud volcanoes, and the wildlife-strewn Lamar Valley. These are only a few of the attractions at the park, many of which can and do claim your life if you are not careful. John Wallace was a 59-year-old man from Chassell, Michigan. He visited Yellowstone National Park the last weeks of August of 2011 and basked in the warm weather and majestic sights at every turn. Since the park doesn't allow firearms and John neglected to purchase bear spray, he was vulnerable but still excited to see the park. John had sat through a safety lecture and announced that he didn't need the class because he was a grizzly bear expert. On August 25th, John struck out at around 7:30 a.m. by himself on the Mary Mountain Trail hike, passing many grizzly bear warning signs on his way. This trail is a known grizzly bear hotspot and is closed from March to June each year due to bears feeding on winter-killed bison. John enjoyed hiking alone, and it isn't uncommon for hikers to traverse the trails alone or at least share them with the local wildlife. John's friends and family considered him a very experienced backcountry traveler and knowledgeable about hiking safety. They also stated that he loved Yellowstone and that he felt like he was in heaven whenever he visited. John hiked and inhaled the pure mountain air for about 5 miles and came upon a stand of lodgepole pines overlooking a small meadow. He decided to sit down for a snack and refreshments. He carefully dug around in his day pack for his snack and pulled out a fruit drink and then relaxed for a break. The trail is not extremely difficult, but it has its rewards in the solitude nature offers to aficionados. John was surrounded by grass on the edge of a meadow and felt at ease. Unbeknownst to John, he was positioned within a few hundred yards of 2 winter-killed bison carcasses that area bears were feeding from. He suddenly heard an approaching animal and probably expected an elk or a bison, both common sights in the area. The animal was a grizzly bear, and yet worse, a sow with a single cub. He hurried to his feet as the bears approached casually. He made some noise and tried to frighten the bears off, but they stared at him and continued their stalk. The evidence indicates that the sow began to attack John and apparently took him to the ground. John used his right forearm to try to fend off her jaws by putting it between the sow and him. That only gave her a handle from which to control him. She bit him several times on his hand and arm as well as clawed him all over his upper body. As he rolled over to protect his vital areas, she bit and clawed him in the back as well. The attack took some time to kill the man before the bear and her cub began feeding on the man's corpse. The bears ate their fill from John's corpse and resumed browsing for whitebark pine nuts, another food source that draws them to the higher elevation of the trail. The next day, a young lady and her father were hiking up the Mary Mountain Trail when she noticed some birds circling an area just before the trees converged on the trail ahead. She carefully climbed over a tree which fell across the trail and saw a plastic bottle with pink fluid in it on the ground. She looked around and saw what she thought was a backpack, and as she approached, she saw boots and legs laying across the trail. The upper body was covered with duff and dirt. John's refreshments and lunch container, along with his rain jacket, were sitting nearby. They had found what remained of John Wallace. Authorities were notified and John's remains were recovered. They collected the tracks of the bears at the attack scene and noticed a pair of tracks from a sow and a cub had blood in their tracks, John's blood. The authorities set up traps to try to collect DNA samples from the local bear population to track down the bears involved in John's attack. After catching and sampling DNA from several bears in the area, the bears were released with radio collars until the test results were returned. The plan was to use the collars to locate any bears of interest. Several weeks later, a sow and her cubs were captured, and she was identified as the bear that was present at John's mauling scene. The track identifiers taken from the attack scene matched this sow and one of her cubs. The 250-pound sow was euthanized on October 2, 2011, and the cubs were placed with the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center in West Yellowstone, Montana. This sow was also the bear tagged and responsible for the horrible bear attack a month earlier on Brian Matayoshi. The year was 1924, and fur trapper Jess Sethington had decided to make his way up to the headwaters of the Unuk River without the companionship of another person. People venturing into the isolated backcountry of Alaska have an unwritten rule, and that was to never go alone. But Jess didn't heed that advice. He was very experienced, after all, and his trip was not supposed to be long in duration. Jess didn't return when scheduled, and 4 of his woodsman friends began the tracking process. They located several of his campsites, and then all the signs of the trapper disappeared. About 9 years later, gold miners and brothers Jack and Bruce Johnstone and their trusty dog Slasher had decided to trek to the productive headwaters of the Unuk River. The labor of the day was exhausting yet rewarding, as the remote area was largely untapped and begrudgingly yielding its gold in exchange for sweat and blood. As the weary men finished up their dinner around the campfire, they heard a distant noise, a drawn-out noise, unlike anything the experienced outdoorsmen had ever heard. They knew the sounds of every animal in the wild, and this noise was definitely strange to them. Slasher's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl as he stared into the blackness beyond the light of the campfire. Their profiles glimmered in the fireglow as they listened and waited. Suddenly the deep moan was closer and more definite. It haunted the darkness of the woods and made their hair stand on end. The waiting and listening only added to the tension. The men checked the actions of their firearms and added more firewood to the campfire. The noise eventually waned, and the miners retired to salvage what sleep they could for the night. The next year, the brothers made the same treacherous journey and decided to explore an area called Sulphide Creek. In the canyon at the headwaters of the creek, the men observed a giant brown bear on the far side of the creek. Upon seeing the men, the bear made a straight line toward them. Jack immediately emptied his rifle into the charging Bruin, but the bear made it across the raging creek and lifted itself up onto the bank, despite an obviously broken back. Jack then pulled his sidearm and completely emptied the gun into the bear just before it slipped on the bank and tumbled into the raging current to be swept away. Upon returning downstream to their boat, the men found the oars splintered and their boat with a gaping hole in the hull. All of this damage was apparently done by a bear. The Johnstone brothers returned the next year and pitched a temporary camp in a flat area and started setting up their sleeping arrangements. In the middle of the night, Jack was awakened to see a giant dark shape silently approach him while he was in his sleeping bag. He slowly reached for his rifle, but Slasher flashed to their defense. The dog and bear hastily chased each other in the bush, surrounded by a cacophonous eruption of barking, growling, and gravel and bushes snapping. Later in the fall of the same year, the men investigated the river shore near the camp and found it strewn with partially consumed salmon carcasses and bear scat and tracks. The previous night, they were stirred from slumber by the now familiar and eerie groaning noises, which faded as the animal departed the area. The brothers went to examine a discovered quartz deposit near the camp. As they returned to camp, Slasher raced into the bushes immediately, behind where they had just spent a considerable amount of time examining the quartz deposit. They could not see the bear, but heard the growling and saw the bushes thrashing as the bear and Slasher confronted each other. Immediately following the incident, the familiar groaning started up once again, as the bear was persuaded to leave. The brothers had to seriously consider the possibility that the bear had been silently lying in ambush for them to get within striking distance. The next summer, the brothers returned with their friend George and their reliable protector, Slasher. Bruce decided to quickly examine the quartz deposit again and left his rifle in the boat. While pushing his way through the tangled underbrush, Bruce heard a loud snort near the trail. The bear charged, but remained in the dense cover, which was shaking in the footfalls of the giant man-killer. As the bear assessed how to kill the man, but remained protected by the foliage, he started the familiar and drawn-out groaning, so familiar now to the men. Armed only with a .410 pistol for protection, Bruce backed down the trail while alternately firing over the bushes and reloading the firearm. The charging bear stopped his charge temporarily, only to resume the charge with more anger and speed than before. Each time Bruce fired his pistol, the bear would pause its charge, giving him a few seconds to reload and fire again once the bear continued the pursuit. Each time the man fired over the bushes, the bear would cough and snort and then moan. This awkward pursuit continued until the pair reached the boat anchored on the shore of the river. The bear always managed to keep enough cover between him and his prey to keep from being shot. Bruce finally dashed across the beach and grabbed his rifle. He spun around ready to dispatch his pursuer, but the bear remained concealed in the brush. For the next 30 minutes, the bear paced and stomped back and forth and groaned. They now knew the bear was trying to ambush them, and was not afraid of an armed man. Later in the fall of that same year, the brothers returned to the area and worked hard to complete a small cabin to shelter themselves. They fell a few cottonwoods and arranged them in a protective yet very preliminary foundation of a cabin. They kept the fire roaring, but the bear returned several times through the night and moaned that sorrowful and tortured regret each time. Slasher would chase him back into the bush, but the bear seemed to grow in boldness in a desperate escalation. The brothers continually held back, using their firearms until they could get a certain kill shot, but the darkness provided the obscurity the bear needed. The last thing they wanted was a wounded and aggressive bear to deal with. The sun finally revealed a safer situation, and the men immediately chugged their coffee and commenced working feverishly on their cabin. After making a satisfactory amount of progress, Bruce decided to stake out their mining claim to ward off competing miners. As he was carving out a stake from a small tree stump, Slasher growled and dashed past him in a blur of fur and teeth. Bruce quickly pivoted and was stunned by the sight of a gigantic, one-eyed bear. Bruce grabbed his rifle and fired from the hip. The bear was mere feet from the end of his rifle barrel, and the bullet found purchase in the bear's massive shoulder. Between the impact of the bullet and the kick of the rifle, the bear and the man were pushed out of the path of one another, and the bear blurred past Bruce. The massive blur of enraged bear piled up just past the man and let out a low and long groan. As the bear regained his feet and turned to charge again, Bruce fired and struck him in the neck. Again, the man-killer collapsed. Incredibly, the bear struggled to its feet again, and this time Bruce placed one of his few remaining bullets just behind the bear's ear, bringing its fury to an end. The bear lay dead at Bruce's feet. Bruce could not believe the size nor the condition of the bear. The deformed mass of the bear was frightening. Bruce observed that the giant bear had thick, leather-like skin with patches of fur, and was deformed in its face. The bear was missing its right eye, which was grown over with scar tissue. Its snout was painfully twisted, with several of its mostly rotten teeth missing and infected. Realizing his lack of ammunition, Bruce called Slasher, and the pair returned to camp. The other two men in the mining camp returned to the carcass to stare in awe and wonder at the massive and deformed man-killer. They hacked its deformed head, as well as its 10-inch wide paws from its carcass, and departed to finish the season with a great amount of peace of mind. Back at camp, Bruce skinned the bear's head, and the culmination of their experiences started to make sense. The bear's right eye socket had at some point prior been shattered by a bullet and healed over. Just above the right eye was another bullet that was in a state of healing as well. A third bullet had grazed the base of the bear's skull. The right jaw socket had been obliterated by at least one bullet, and the bones of the bear's jaw did not meet, nor had they healed. They remained infected and decaying as the bear lived on. Below the bear's jaw rested two .33 caliber bullets, and in the gristle of the jaw he discovered three .38 caliber bullets from a pistol. The disappearance of Jeff Sethington flashed back to Bruce's mind, and he shuddered at the realization of the position the man had to be in to fire the bullets into the bear at that angle. The following year, the men returned to the location of the carcass and examined the bear's remains, now only bones. Bruce found that 4 of the bear's vertebrae had fused together into a single vertebrae just over 8 inches in length. The giant bear's back had been broken, and the 2 adjoining ribs had grown together and fused with each other. Could this be the same bear that charged the brothers from across the creek and was washed downstream in the raging current?
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place just a few miles south of beautiful and scenic Jasper, Alberta, Canada. The surroundings are a foreboding yet breathtaking environment of rugged mountains and deep, luscious forests. This is a land a person can easily become lost in forever. The frigid month of November 2015, 2 mountain climbers trudged through the knee-deep snow of the Canadian Rockies. Located near Jasper and surrounded by some of the most picturesque mountains and forests on Earth. The climb was difficult but exhilarating, as participating in their passion has led the 2 men to a close friendship. The goal was to climb a peak called Dirty Love, which is a climb located on Wilson Peak. It would consist of scrambles and treacherous snowfield navigation, which could present avalanche danger and crevasses. After reaching the top, the 2 men began the descent. The darkness of the night embraced them, as it was a new moon, meaning that the men had to use their headlamps to reveal their path. The men had left their ropes and other equipment along their descent trail to be recovered as they returned. The return trail would be complicated by a few cliff rappels the pair would have to make to get home safely, but their experience and aptitude would make it easy, barring any unexpected circumstances. Greg Boswell was an experienced Scottish adventurer and climber. As he bent down to fill his water bottle in a nearby spring before the men rappelled down the cliff, a large brown bear suddenly appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. Normally at this time of year, healthy bears are hibernating comfortably, living off the fat they've built up through their summer foraging. The bears seemed surprised and acted in perceived self-defense by attacking. Back near the rappelling point, Nick Bullock was lost in the exhilarating memory of the trek when he was shaken back to the terrified yelling of his companion. "Bear!" he heard struggle from Greg's mouth as he scurried past. The light of Nick's headlamp flashed a confusing scene of his friend's arms and legs scrambling to create distance between him and the confused and now enraged bear. Nick was in awe of the powerful beast as it churned through the snow in pursuit of his friend. As it blurred past Nick, the bear glanced at him, and his knees felt as if they would buckle from fear. At that point his companion had tripped, which refocused the bear's rage. Nick took this as his cue to beat feet. He sprinted in the opposite direction as fast as the conditions would safely allow. His mind fogged by the situation, he witnessed his friend in a death struggle with the massive Bruin. Greg was kicking and shouting as the bear bit through his climbing boot easily. It redirected its rage on his lower leg and hoisted him precariously off the ground. Greg's frightened yells for help sent chills down his companion's back. Temporarily concerned for only his own safety, Nick considers self-preservation as he focuses on his own escape. After hearing his friend plead for his help, Nick builds his resolution to commitment to protect and defend his friend. He begins walking straight toward the grizzly, now bearing down on his friend once again. Suddenly, Nick's headlamp was filled with the terrified face of his companion. Greg had somehow managed to escape the bear's rage, and the 2 yelled and ran back along their initial trail. As they parted the dense undergrowth, they resolved to stay close and help each other. Terrified that the massive bear, now concealed by the darkness, might suddenly reemerge and continue its rage-filled attack, the men stumbled and slipped their way around the mountain for the better part of a quarter an hour, before the reality of their only escape path set in. Greg hastily repacked the climbing gear the pair knew they would need while Nick stood watch. Their only means of defense were their climbing axes held high in defiant defense of their lives and any threat to them. The two resolved their commitment to mutual defense. If they went down, they would go down fighting together. As they fled, the men were so confused they had followed the wrong trail and quickly became hopelessly lost. They took temporary shelter under a large, sturdy tree and discussed waiting for daybreak before finishing their descent. Greg offered the idea that the pair should climb the tree for protection, but Nick was deterred by the frigid conditions and his partner's injuries. They agreed that their only option was to get back down and reach safety as soon as possible. At this point, injured severely, Greg announced that they needed to get to the waypoint cliff and rappel down. He immediately threw himself over the short cliff above the area that they could rappel down, tumbling head over feet. Greg's outline was highlighted by puffs of powdered snow as he landed safely just below. Nick immediately followed suit in the near-suicidal leap. The two men were committed to getting to safety and to each other. By the grace of the mercy God has for fools, the two men stopped their out-of-control fall at the edge of a cliff. Their minds finally started to clear, and they realized they must return to the attack site to descend properly using their ropes and the other equipment to be safe. Greg was hesitant after all he'd been through, but Nick exerted his conviction, and the men finally agreed. The possible hopeless situation weighed heavily on both men. After navigating the ridiculous terrain, the men had found the point in their path that they had erred. They found the ropes. As Nick watched Greg clip onto the rope and start his descent off the cliff, Nick's vulnerability became a reality to him. He decided if he was charged by the bear, he would simply jump off the cliff, probably to his death, to avoid being attacked and mangled. Finally, Greg's triumphant announcement of his successful descent reached his ears, and Nick clipped in and quickly escaped the bear and its terror. The men began trudging down the trail as fast as the adrenaline would let them. Blood squirted out of the perforations in Greg's boot made by the bear's teeth and stained the snow along their trail. Reaching their last descent, Greg again clipped in as Nick defended the pair with their ice axes, still unsure if the bear was pursuing them. Completing their descent, the men clambered into the jeep just after the midnight hour, after about 5 hours after the attack. The friends drove straight to the hospital for treatment for Greg's injuries. After acute medical treatment, Greg eventually made a complete recovery and resumed his adventures.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Our episode today involved one of the worst bear attacks in the world. It is gruesome and disturbing. Please make sure you are prepared to hear these kinds of details. In the lush arboreal forests of British Columbia, Canada, near a town called Fort Nelson, Laird Hot Spring is a favorite soaking spot for travelers and locals alike. The Alaska Highway, which traverses western Canada, runs a short distance away, making it an easily accessed stopping point. A doting 37-year-old mother, Patty McConnell, fled her home in Paris, Texas, was hoping to rebuild her life, had just arrived at the hot springs with her 2 children. The trio had been driving for about a week and were road weary. They needed a break, and soaking in the hot springs seemed like the solution. Her 13-year-old son Kelly, as well as her 7-year-old daughter Kristen, hurried to get into their swimsuits and shake off the cramped position sitting in the car. Patty entered the dressing room and gladly recognized how much the small family recess would rejuvenate them. The wooden walkway felt moist and thumped as they eagerly strode toward the primary pool that was 127 degrees and would immediately melt away all their stress. After a short while, the group made their way about a quarter mile to the next pool. Little Kristen was too energetic and needed to move around, so she returned to the first pool and started playing with some new friends.
Patty was concerned about her daughter, but relieved to see her get some of her youthful energy out, and after a few minutes, she and Kelly followed Kristen. As they walked along the boardwalk, they approached a directional arrow that marked the area of the facility known as the Hanging Gardens. Kelly begged his mom to take a look, so they slowly climbed the stairs to reach the viewing platform. The beauty of flora and fauna spread before them as they marveled at the greenery and diversity of nature. They failed to notice a very important rustling in the bushes near the boardwalk. Patty urged Kelly to return with her to find Kristen and make sure she was okay. As Patty led the way down the stairs, she carefully noted her footsteps and felt uneasy. She glanced up and stared right into the eyes of a very large black bear. He was chewing on some shrubbery while staring right at her. Patty could scarcely utter a whisper as she forced the words from her mouth. "Kelly, bear." He responded with the typical teenage response, "Sure, Mom," as if he'd been fooled too many times to fall for that trick. He was busy looking the other direction and still admiring the view. Patty uttered his name with more desperation. "Kelly!" The young man decided to go along and turned around. He witnessed in bewilderment a standoff between his mother and the large predator. They were way too close for comfort. Kelly drew on his research and told his mother, "Mom, don't make any sudden moves." The bear was still off the boardwalk, but was positioned at the same level on the hillside forest floor. Kelly slowly eased nearer to his mother, just as the bear released a snort and exploded through the stair railings and onto the boardwalk. Kelly yelled out, "Mom, run!" Patty and Kelly both started sprinting along the boardwalk, and the bear followed in close pursuit. She returned to the viewing platform but had nowhere else to run from there. The bear leapt on top of Patty and immediately started biting her in a rapid attempt to kill her. Kelly attacked the bear, kicking and screaming, "Get off my mom!" The bear paused momentarily and resumed the predatory assault on Patty. A resolve rose up in Kelly, and he grabbed a loose limb laying nearby and brought the improvised weapon down on the Bruin's head and loudly raised the alarm to anyone nearby. As he screamed, he noticed his mother's blood on the bear's canine teeth and was immediately even more energized to chase the bear from his mother. Kelly's frenzied counterattack drew blood on the bear's nose. The bear swatted Kelly and clawed him on his neck and along his shoulders. The bear then focused his attention on Kelly. The bear smothered the young man with its immense size and clamped its jaws onto his waist. Kelly was lifted into the air and the bear tossed him back and forth violently. Kelly struggled to hold on to his wits as he was flung across the viewing deck. As soon as he landed, he curled up into a ball to protect his vulnerable body. It was then that Kelly glanced toward his mother. Her skin was flushed of color, and her eyes were open and still. Kelly tried to move closer to his mother, but the bear jumped on him and started to bite him and tear at his flesh. The stench from the bear completed the terrible scene, and Kelly felt his life ebbing away. Ray Kitchen was delivering some construction supplies in the area and had pulled over at Laird to soak and relax with his daughter, Jolene. She was 11 and was riding on the truck with her father for the day. Ray was enjoying the warmth and serenity of the area when a terrified scream snapped his head and forced him to his feet. Ray hurried with concern along the boardwalk toward the viewing platform. That is when he saw the giant bear standing over Kelly, tearing him to pieces. Ray could see enormous gashes and missing chunks of flesh from both Kelly and his mother. Ray armed himself with a tree limb and tried to distract the bear by banging it on the handrail of the boardwalk. "Get off!" he yelled, but the bear continued to savage Kelly. Ray then took a tree limb and jammed it into the bear as hard as he could. The now enraged bear focused its fury on Ray. It charged into him and drove him through the railings and onto the forest floor with it. Ray crawled his way to a nearby tree and covered himself defensively. He yelled for help, and Frank Headingham heard him. Frank was near the lower pool and immediately thought the noise was young people having fun. Then he heard the word bear. The spry 71-year-old hustled toward the noise, and a few people joined him. Ingrid Bailey was one of those people sifting through the fleeing people to get to the screams with Frank. The heroes approached the viewing platform and were shocked by the condition of Kelly and his mother on the deck. Then they noticed the struggle just below the boardwalk. Ingrid Bailey was one of those people sifting through the fleeing people to get to the screams with Frank. The heroes approached the viewing platform and were shocked by the condition of Kelly and his mother on the deck. Then they noticed the struggle just below the boardwalk. Ray was wrestling with the attacking bear, and it had latched onto his upper arm and was biting him repeatedly, its slashing claws tearing his flesh, and he fought back and yelled in protest.
Bailey and Headingham were joined by Paul Westerveld now, and the three of them banged on the boardwalk and threw wood and stumps down at the bear in an attempt to distract it from its attack. Nothing worked, and the bear continued to ravage Ray beneath them. Bailey knew that they could not stop the bear attack without a firearm, but he could not locate a ranger nor a gun. Westerveld immediately announced he was going to find a park ranger and dashed away. Headingham continued to assault the bear with wood and limbs in exhaustion. It was then that the bear changed its position and locked its jaws onto Ray's neck. It ragdolled him, just like it did to Kelly previously. Bailey screamed in shock and fear. Ray was clearly dead after that. His neck was gashed open and his windpipe was torn out. His head was barely attached, and his fight was finished. The bear dropped Ray and disappeared under the boardwalk. Bailey and Headingham immediately rushed to help Kelly and his mother. Kelly was moaning and starting to move, so they focused on him. It was at that moment that Bailey saw the claws of the massive maneater curl over the edge of the boardwalk, only a few inches from her feet. Headingham was instantly fighting mad as he realized the bear was not done with them. He kicked the bear, and it staggered back in pain. The bear started to make its way toward the lower boardwalk, distracted by the panicked and fleeing people. Headingham reassured Kelly as he pleaded for someone to help his mother, still unsure if she was dead or not. Headingham administered first aid as best he could for Kelly, but recognized the gravity of the situation. "What we need is towels to act as compresses, and 2 more pairs of hands for CPR, Headingham said out loud. As if his pleas had gone heard and answered, 2 men ran up to help. The triage area was strewn with blood and bodies. The rescuers aimed to get medical help as well as security from the ranger. Headingham dashed to find more help. Renewed screams broke out through the forest as Ari van der Velden slipped and fell off the boardwalk. A 28-year-old research assistant visiting from the University of Calgary, Ari was relaxing in the upper pool when the chaos broke out. Ari was attempting to regain his feet when the bear leaped on top of him. The immense weight of the bear smashed Ari into the ground, and he fought back by grabbing the bear's ears and kicking him in the nose. The frenzied bear was relentless and dug his canine teeth into Ari's thigh and gashed his back with razor-sharp claws. Headingham finally reached the parking lot where Dave Webb was just getting out of his vehicle. The 49-year-old Fairbanks businessman was caught off guard by Headingham's appearance as he was bleeding from various injuries on his body. Headingham relayed the details of the horrendous attack. Webb retrieved 2 firearms from his RV and recruited help to confront and eliminate the bear. Dwayne Eggebrotten was a 27-year-old man at the time of the attack, and he grabbed one of Webb's firearms. He ran down the boardwalk to intervene. As he scanned the bush beneath the boardwalk, he could hear the moans of the wounded and finally located the bear. Van der Velden was leaning against a log, and the bear was feeding on him. Eggebrotten took quick aim and fired the rifle once, and then again. His bullet found its mark at the base of the bear's skull. The bear collapsed and received 2 more bullets to make sure. Ray Kitchen's actions that day saved many lives. He was honored in a letter from Bill Clinton, praising Ray's nobility and selflessness. Ray was also awarded the Star of Courage from the Canadian government in 1998. Kelly McConnell survived while his mother died later the same day of the attack. Frank Headingham, Brad Westerveld, and Ingrid Bailey performed exceptionally in saving many people's lives during the tragedy as well. Ari van der Velden lived and eventually recovered from his life-threatening injuries. Each of them were also presented with awards for their bravery during the tragedy.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.